Because there's very few things that exist in our public realm that people would be able to talk about in 50 years.
I'm John Lewis, and you're listening to 360 Degree City, a podcast where we talk to people who are working to make cities better. Our hope is that after each episode, you'll start to see your own city from a slightly different angle. Public art can give a community a unique identity, brighten up the street, and challenge how we think about issues in our cities. It can also spark a lot of controversy, as it has many times here in Calgary over the last year.
Well, a massive new sculpture in Calgary is definitely moving a lot of people there into writing hate mail.
On social media, the art is getting scathing reviews.
1% of infrastructure projects in Calgary, the money does go toward public art. And in general, it really is a great idea because it gets all of us talking.
We wanted to talk to someone that creates art in the public realm to understand the process and the work itself. Luckily, we didn't have to look very far.
Hi, my name is Daniel J. Kirk, and I am a visual artist, to put it very plainly.
In addition to being an amazing artist who mainly works on public and community-based projects, Daniel is also the co-founder of Blank Page Studio, a creative and collaborative workspace here in Calgary. Our company, Intelligent Futures, is based at Blank Page Studio, so I basically just had to yell across the hall and invite him over to my house for a chat. A lot of our conversation focused on Calgary, but many of the lessons can be applied to whatever city that you find yourself in. In this episode, Daniel talks about public art policy, the process of painting murals, how it felt to have a golf ball thrown at his head, and how someone's pet gerbil got incorporated into one of his murals. Thanks for joining us at my kitchen table. Can you tell us how you got to where you are in your career today?
In my career, so I guess I've always been a drawer, painter, visual expresser in a way. That was the kind of earliest memories of being passionate about anything that I really have is just drawing. That sort of evolved into a university degree in art, and for lack of kind of understanding like what the definition or role of an artist was, I just kind of continued down a certain path of exploring, giving myself time to kind of try to be an artist, which is like, you know, everyone always asks like, well, what is that? What do you actually do? How do you make a living at that? There's a lot of different, you know, ways of approaching it. It's basically, you know, it's a lifestyle or a hobby for a lot of people. It's a career for me, and it will probably always be just how I identify myself. After doing a Bachelor of Fine Arts, I traveled around a little bit and went through Central America, Mexico, and have been a few places since then to kind of contextualize my life in Calgary. And I just keep kind of making work here and finding projects and working with other artists and continuously being inspired and giving it a shake.
Great.
Yeah.
So a lot of your work is community-based and in the public domain. Can you maybe explain why you chose that path, if you actually chose it or it just happened to be?
Yeah, I was never really drawn to making specifically like gallery-based work. I love going to museums, galleries, you know, art viewing contexts and seeing other people's ideas in those sorts of spaces and what it sort of provides in terms of clarity and you know, the curation and the support that kind of comes from that. But I guess I approached art pretty early as being, you know, it was a way of communicating ideas for me almost to myself. And so it was a very like deep-rooted kind of cathartic thing for me without even really realizing it. The sketchbook, you know, I would escape into it, and I would use that in a way to kind of understand my own thoughts and my own feelings about things. And then, you know, approaching a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the perspective that I had on like what art was at that time and where it would go was kind of more from like, you know, I'm going to work for Disney, or I'm going to, you know, work for, you know, like a magazine company, or doing advertisement or marketing or something like that. That was more like, what do you actually do as an artist? I didn't know that, you know, art history yet. I didn't have any context of putting this like passion for drawing or expressing visually into like some kind of a bigger perspective on what it actually is. So public work kind of came in pretty naturally through just some opportunities to paint. First, when I was traveling in Central America, ended up doing some mural work as a way of trading some skills for accommodation. And
oh, really?
Yeah. Oh. So kind of going through Mexico a little bit and being really inspired by a lot of the street work that is just so colorful and vibrant, and then the historical work of, you know, like muralists like Diego Rivera or something like that, and being able to kind of understand it in a slightly different way of like, this is visual communication that it maybe transcends language. So trying to learn Spanish for the first time and having a lot of difficulty with that, being an English speaker and only English speaker. I would, you know, talk to people through drawing. So having the sketchbook was a huge tool for kind of connecting with people, and then recognizing that is something that works really well for public space. Like it mural based work seemed to draw people into wanting to talk and hang out and share ideas. So
and do you get a sense that the particular culture, I guess, of Mexico and you going through, was that probably unique in terms of you being able to trade, if you will, in mural work for accommodation? Like, do you think you could pull that off in, I don't know, Ireland or somewhere? Like, was it sort of the local language of a place that helped with that, do you think?
Maybe. I mean, I since then I've, like, you know, traveled through Turkey, spent 5-6 months going through Turkey and drawing portraits for people. I found a really similar kind of like exchange. There was a value in it, enough for, you know, exchange of maybe money or a meal or something like that, or just, again, the time, like sharing 10-15 minutes with like a stranger who doesn't speak the same language as you is a pretty unique thing, to kind of like really look at someone and allow them to, you know, to sort of not allow them. If anything, they're allowing you to kind of, you know, to share that time and connect with them, but not in the way that's sort of as typical through conversation or, you know, where are you from? Where's your family? Those type of things. What do you do for a living? You know? Yeah. How about your career? I guess then, like, the public work in Calgary that has unfolded as a result of those things is I guess in a sense, it was both kind of like a need to do something with the material buildup that I sort of had. So a really functional, practical thing of just like, if you're painting a mural on the side of a building, you don't have to have the canvas, the stretcher, store the material, make the space inside for it, and then try to find someone to buy it like after or work on it for someone specifically. You're making work in a space that exists, and you're able to simply just use the mediums without having the whole like infrastructure around the surface, you know? And that murals just become like, they're a really easy way, and not easy, but like an economical thing. Like, they're, you know, people understand the value you put in your time and energy into a mural project. It's as I found, it was like a way for school boards or the city or community associations to like kind of use up a little of their end of year budget. It was like, to have a couple extra $1,000 floating around and be like, oh, well, we should just do a mural on this wall. And then I could come in and do that.
What does that conversation look like when you're talking to a potential client, I guess, about what a mural portrays? You talked about visual communication, what it communicates. Can you talk about how you navigate that process, especially for something that has a public face to it as well?
Yeah. It gets like, the context is really important for what the work ends up becoming. And
do you mean the physical context?
The physical context, okay. You know, like the physical context, but also, who's involved in planning it, who's funding it, where the money's coming from to pay for it. I think a lot of times that's like, you know, mural work itself, I think, at least in the city of Calgary, in my experience, has been largely like service-based kind of, providing a service. Less
you providing a service?
Yeah, it's less of sort of like, come and bring your artistic expression into this public place. It's kind of more like, how can we, use you as a resource to express, our ideas. So it's sort of like, giving voice or providing that sort of like vision for someone else's, like, let's talk about respect or community or, like in community projects, how many times people want the mural itself to be about community? Well, how do you depict community, and how do you depict community using the resources maybe of that community? Like this is the word gets used to death. You have 15 or 20, quite often like young people, kids, students, let's involve the kids in the project, and let's involve maybe members of the community at large or something. And those always become much more, you spend a lot more time in the sort of development of an idea than you do in actually just painting the project. Painting might only take a day, but you spend a month planning it and working with people and developing the conversation around, how do we represent an idea visually? How do we actually go about, painting it? Public work, if you're doing calls, like responding to open calls, you're kind of asked to put forth ideas, but then again within a context, right? A city, a specific community, a geographical location, or a historical context, or something like that. So you're always still kind of like trying to visually embody something that maybe just, it's not just your idea, it's
right. Is that a major distinction between work in the public domain, in terms of it being created by the public and seen by the public, just a passerby, versus someone that works in a more private gallery environment? I
think so. At least, again, from not having a ton of experience working really privately, in private collections or private galleries, or even in the way that I think I've really created like my working studio space. It's pretty open, that to kind of like close the doors and get lost in my own thoughts and ideas about things might be something that I'm actually really like missing in my practice, feeling a little...
Yeah, because people like us keep coming in.
Keep coming in, You can't stop the people from coming in when the door's open. But I also think I have a bit of a fear around closing the door, because, then when you're just left to your own feelings, thoughts, ideas, there's no scapegoats. Public work, I can kind of... And I think that's why largely a lot of cities want to have more participation in public art making, whether it's through the jury process or community engagement, this sort of like, buzzword that gets thrown around a lot, this community engagement. Well, I think what that does is that without some type of check in place, and I don't know what that looks like really, but like the community, art made by popular demand is not really going to necessarily challenge, art history, and it's not really going to bring forth like this sort of like conversation around elitism in art always gets brought up. Like, we hired an artist from, New York City to come in and make some. Why didn't we hire a local artist? Why didn't we, why did that cost $500,000? Or why did that, and these sorts of things. It's always a sort of economic conversation, or, it's very rarely about the ideas in Calgary. Like that the idea, like accepting that like public art is just like, it's important and it's part of the fabric that makes up a city, and that, and then we can kind of start the conversation after that. But we kind of keep having to always go back and like justify it. And I still think like that's been a huge part of my practice, is like growing the vocabulary around it, and letting people into the artistic process that I think is quite often very alienating to a lot of people, and, showing the kind of the creative capacity within every individual.
Right.
Just get out of your own way and show up to the project and lend your ideas and then see what comes out.
So if you were to articulate or try to articulate to someone the value of public art, if you had a minute to do that with a key decision maker or a grumpy taxpayer or everybody in between, what would be your stump speech on
the value
why
of public art
is valuable in a city?
So public art is valuable because it creates like a conversation that is beyond like one specific community or niche or one area in the city specifically. Though the artwork might exist in one area, you see that conversation through the media's lens, through the administration lens, through the general public and the community's lens, through the artistic community's lens. Like all of those, it's this really great meeting place to have hard, challenging conversations. And the value in public art goes far beyond the sort of like price tag attached to it. But again, money is the tool that we use to measure value quite often, especially in our culture here. So, it's a lot dealing with like intrinsic value, right. And it's hard to measure, especially in the first month of its creation or something. It's like this is designed to be a legacy or I probably passed a minute now, but
no, it's pretty concise.
Yeah. Just like, talk about it in 50 years and see what that means. Because there's very few things that exist in our public realm that people would be able to talk about in 50 years, that you're creating this glimpse into contemporary thought or material or medium or, even the context, again, like if it's on the side of a road, says a lot, but you have to remove yourself in order to really like look at it, like we value the roadways more than the artwork. Of course, well, everyone would agree, but yet we're not complaining about the cost of the roadway ever, right? The roadways project is a capital project and 1% of that money is designated to public art. That's been unanimously decided upon through several different councils now. Different councillors have voiced their, dissent for that, but kind of globally throughout any city in the world, there's some acceptance of the value of public art adding to a cityscape beyond this sort of like economic value that,
price tag for an object.
Price tag for an object equals that's kind of like really straight, but again, we've lost track of what actual value looks like. It's all been disconnected. And when you're trying to bring forth an original piece of work with original ideas behind it for the first time ever, working with certain materials or mediums in that specific location, you're forging the way for new thoughts and new innovative ways of doing something, whether it's a giant ring on the side of a bridge or suspending huge pieces of Rundle rock on steel girders.
Hey, I'm Jeff, the design lead at Intelligent Futures. I thought I'd pop in to give you a bit of context about this blue ring that has been mentioned a few times. In 2013 in Calgary, an art installation called the Traveling Light was built in the city's far northwest. It's a giant blue ring resembling an upright 17-meter hula hoop that is attached to a streetlight on a busy road. The story behind this piece actually has quite a bit of depth and complexity, but the Traveling Light has become known as the piece of public art in the city that most Calgarians love to hate. Now back to John and Daniel.
It's 1% of the capital project. It's not a lot of money when you put it into context, but it's always the way that we're having that. It's where all the
attention goes.
Yeah, it's where the attention goes. It's the cost of a house.
Yeah,
$500,000 is a seemingly like a very angry amount of money.
Do you have any experiences or stories you could tell about your inclusive design approach and shifting some perspectives or mindsets about public art and the value in some of your work?
I guess it's like over the last year, we've been trying to kind of integrate art projects into road reconstruction in a different way. So kind of like not not just making the sort of like, here's the money, here's the object type of thing. Being more at the table consistently has been sort of my own little art project within the greater project. It's like, how can every opportunity to talk about art in these sort of, in
an ongoing construction project.
Generally it's engineers around the table, or, city employees or something, just trying to kind of challenge why we would do it that way, or what the thinking is there. And I think that's more where I've been able to kind of insert my own curiosities and research into this sort of, the actual then like outcomes, really trying to then hire like other artists so that I'm not both accountable at that table, but I can provide a bit of a buffer to other artists to have more, potentially creative freedom over their own work. And I think it's hard because I would love to see public work that is really like given the freedom to be critical. It's kind of provided the context to be very safe work most of the time. And I use the word safe in that, like, yes, it has to be like structurally safe and undergo extreme kind of engineering reviews for like a permanent piece of infrastructure that, could crush a person if, installed improperly. But that the actual content of the work quite often,
that idea.
The idea itself, we're still talking about it on the economic level or on the structural level or the, the functional level. It doesn't do anything. Why is it valuable? Still trying to kind of understand that like the conversation about the idea is the value, and that's like priceless.
And does that go back to one of your first points about sort of follow the money? So if it's a relatively conservative, risk-averse, municipal government, let's say, that's funding that, then let's just get through the challenge of cost and rage with the taxpayer versus an idea that'll really challenge things. Do you
Absolutely.
Find that that's the case?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that, well summarized. Because I think that, at least in my perspective, we're still, constantly having to justify, not just to the public, but then to the officials and to the people that are actually, we've decided that it's a good policy, we move forward with it, but again, we're still kind of into the realm of making things that that don't really challenge, and if it did challenge, then potentially we just lose the funding. Like it's like, being in a relationship with somebody, but not really trusting that that they're going to be there at the end of the day if you said something they didn't like to hear,
Right.
Yeah.
Where are you going tonight?
Yeah. Like, I'm here to stay. Artists have chosen to, live in the city and make their lives here. And a lot of times I think artists talk about it because they're able to participate in a greater municipal conversation. And there's a lot to work on here. And it's really easy to shake the boat, to rock the boat and kind of mix it up here a little bit. But to do it in a larger way is still kind of like
so it really sounds like you need to take the long view. If you're in a specific project, you need to take the long view that you're contributing to that shift or to the culture shift in a city, which is often painful in the short term. But each individual artist and each individual project contributes to that shift over the long term.
I think so. Yeah. And I've seen it. I mean, I would say you could go on record as being like the summer of 2017 was a paradigm shift in the way that this city accepted mural work in the downtown. Really? So up until this summer, you didn't see any like support for large scale kind of mural work. We don't have a mural festival in the city. There's been like a pretty flourishing but kind of fringe like graffiti culture in Calgary that has been kind of, you could say, given small opportunities that, again, it's sort of like having an alcoholic son at 18 because you didn't allow him to drink until his 18th birthday, and then suddenly he just like went for it. It was kind of like everything was repressed to this certain level that then when given the smallest little opportunity to kind of like express something, it was immediate like, well, let's really go there then. Let's go for it. And that was, in my lifetime now, sort of seeing that like, Calgary's like visual street culture is I mean, we punish it here in a very like authoritative and controlling way. And that was largely, and it's largely pertaining to the sort of bylaw culture, but also the kind of corporate culture here of like, you know, things are organized and we pride ourselves on having a clean city and that sort of really structured grid, 90-degree angle kind of mentality, you know, where we put the onus on the business owner to paint out graffiti. So they hate, you know, of course, they hate the tagging, the graffiti that might show up. But until recently, it wasn't even acceptable for a private owner of a business or a residence to then like hire an artist to paint something, because it was still considered like if a public member complained about that, then bylaw services still had the control to paint it out or fine the owner of that space, even if it was a commissioned piece.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, because it was so subjective. The bylaws surrounding like what is graffiti is basically anything scribbled, scratched, sprayed, or adhered to a surface without the consent or permission of the owner of the premise. But then there's another like subclause in terms of like, you know, again, because it's in the public. If you had your daughter paint your garage door, well, that you've given her permission to do that piece. But if 2 or 3 neighbors were unhappy with what that was, suddenly it takes it kind of, I don't like to use the word Trump anymore, but like Trump's, it's a Trump card, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so now recently that conversation has gone far enough such that, no, I mean, if that's the law, you have permission to do it. It's your own property. We value private property here in such a huge way that to take that rationally to its conclusion is, you know, it's important to do that. You know, you can put an advertisement up if you're, you know, Pattison, and that could be anything, a half-naked woman selling you a watch, without any consent or community support at all. But that's considered private space, even though it's in the public realm. Versus, you know, sometimes it takes me a year to get a mural approved.
Interesting.
Because the mechanisms for controlling that like communication are very different. If it's ad-based, it's easy.
Yeah.
You understand what the motivation is. If it's like you want to actually criticize the advertisement on the billboard, good luck, you know.
I hadn't thought of it that way. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And I didn't know about that sort of that clause, as you say.
Yeah.
And that's you can see how that's a dangerous combination of a hard fist authoritarian delivery of a bylaw that also has a ton of subjectivity to it.
Totally. Right? So a bylaw officer who has no arts training can make a subjective call on whether this is art or vandalism. And, you know, and fueled by potentially an upset neighbor because you move their garbages, or who knows, right? It could have nothing to do with the content of that. So again, that conversation has now started to shift, and you saw this summer a support through the Beltline Community Investment Fund in a huge like $60,000-$70,000 amount of money going into different artists throughout the Beltline area, and resulting in about 4 different huge projects that are now like permanent parts of the downtown, and just also like I think people. I've felt more and more this sort of conversation shift to where people have traveled enough or from different places enough that they just get the value of like, oh, I love this. You know, street art becomes something that, again, you take photos in front of, or you bring your kids to, or you know, it's just... It
makes the city more interesting.
And they're...
At minimum.
At minimum.
Yeah.
You're listening to 360 Degree City. Today, John is talking to Daniel J. Kirk about public art.
So you mentioned tagging a few minutes ago, and I wanted to talk about personal, direct experience with tagging. So we share Blank Page Studio together, and you helped found that. And outside, there's been different iterations of a mural that you've created. And when we moved in, the first iteration of the mural got tagged numerous times, and I recall turning the corner and swearing and being super angry. And then I talked to you about it and you just kind of took it in stride. And you actually adapted and incorporated those tags into an evolution of the mural. Could you maybe explain to me, I guess, first of all, how you did that with such grace when someone's tagging your work that you've put all that time into, and just, I guess, the mindset and approach of being okay with that, and that's just part of it, and evolving the concept to incorporate those acts of vandalism in some way.
Yeah, I guess it's like in the public realm, you surrender to this sort of chaos that exists within our world. Like it just, I don't know, that's kind of weirdly existential or something. It doesn't, like, I look at that and of course the first thing I see is like, you know, I'm upset. But then like working through, you take your own sort of personal like ego out of it in a way, and like it wasn't an attack on me. I didn't, you know, it hurt more when someone like threw a golf ball at me, like driving by in a car. There's like physical pain, but also like, why me? You know, why did that? You know, but then again, realizing like, oh, that they weren't upset with me. They actually don't know me. They just wanted to like throw a golf ball at someone. You know, the people that tag the wall like potentially don't know anything about me or my work. Maybe they didn't like the work, but quite often I see like if a mural is getting tagged, it's harder to paint it out. It doesn't disappear as fast. So
as opposed to just on somebody's fence.
A blank wall,
okay,
you can just roll over gray on
Yeah.
a blank wall and the tag disappears overnight. It almost didn't exist quite often, right? To buff it out is really easy. If you go over a mural, now you're confronted with, do we restore the mural? Do we take it all down? Do we paint the whole thing out and hire someone else to come in and do it? Do I paint the whole thing again? I mean, you know, there's no money there. It's a side of our studio. There was, you know, a tiny bit of support, right, for that initial project, but that then Bylaw Services comes and serves me with a yellow piece of paper that's a notice to kind of, you know, paint it out.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And so, you know, again, I'll do what I can, but it's funny because for me to like integrate the tags into the mural, like it's just this funny line. Like why did the tags not add to it on its own? You know?
Right.
So then we're looking at like, well, maybe the intention behind the work versus whatever it is. Because the work itself is like the byproduct was just subjective. You know? Oh, I really don't like the way that person wrote their name on the side of that building. Like, oh, did you know that cost $500,000 and it's a specific artist? I'm like, oh, no, I didn't know that. Oh, maybe I like it more now. Or maybe I hate it more now or whatever.
Right.
The end result is still just like paint on a wall. You know?
Yeah.
It doesn't disturb the infrastructure of the building. What it does is disturb the like foundation of our social order or something, right? It's like if we allow the vandals to get away with like a little bit, then, you know, the whole city will catch on fire and it'll all come tumbling down. It's like, you know, that kind of like broken window effect that I think Mayor Giuliani in New York like takes a lot of credit for, though I think it was his police chief that actually like came up with the idea. There was like this, you know, this interesting amount of research that went into it and continues to go into it. And I have been to like, you know, anti-graffiti symposiums where there's 300, you know, law enforcement officials from across North America and the Western kind of world talking about like abatement practices and how to best kind of like, you know, look at treating this as, again, like treating like this symptom or this illness, but not really looking at like the kind of reasons for this. Like I look at it more just like, hey, I mean, since the dawn of time, we wanted to write on the walls and we wanted to like, you know, express something. I am here now, you know, like I look at the kind of first thing that most kids learn in our culture is like how to write their name. And they do that not to vandalize, but to take ownership. And I think in my perspective, what tagging and the kind of culture around it is quite often it might be destructive in its intention. But I think beyond that is this really like it's an entire community of people that potentially want to play a bigger part, have a purpose, have a role within their community. And kind of like, I would say most of the people that are out like actively tagging in the city know the city better than most people that, you know, claim that that's like a vandalistic act. And, you know, they know the city, they're watching it, they're, you know, keeping tabs on who's in there and who's, you know, writing their name on top of each other. And it's this interesting kind of conversation. And I think that's why I wanted to like not just paint it out, but try to integrate it, because it's like, why is my work more valuable than theirs? I you know, I've been given this opportunity to paint something, and I did it in a very like safe way, potentially in the daytime with permission, and you know, and they did it at night without permission and did it in like a couple hours versus I spent a week. I think time plays a huge part of it. Yeah. What the quality is. And,
yeah, for sure. And so one of the other things that I think is fascinating about the work that you do, in addition to sort of that mindset and that grace that you deal with the chaos, if you will, because that's part of it. It's really, you articulated that really well, is when you do your work, you don't just throw on a set of headphones and ignore the world and do your thing. You interact with the members of the community that are around. Wondering if you could maybe share one story about an interaction that you've had in some of your work and how that actually impacted the work itself eventually.
Yeah. I mean, that's like, sometimes it's really hard to predict what's going to happen. And well, no, it's not sometimes, all the time. You're just like surrendering to this sort of process. You have an idea of where you want to take the design, or, you know, the palette or whatever you're kind of working with, and you're working with quite often an approved design, and then you're implementing that. But we were working on a series of surfaces down in the kind of East Village area in Calgary over the course of like 7 or 8 months, really. Myself, Ivan Ostapenko, and Kai Kabanuk-Butcher, Kabadinia now, he's married. And at the, you know, at the onset of that project, we were trying to like understand the community in that area and the influences, and it's the confluence of two rivers, and it's a really important place for Calgary, and Mohensis, as it's known in Blackfoot, is a sort of like traditional elbow of the landscape where there was, you know, wintering grounds and this sort of thing. And we were working like right across the street from the drop-in center, and we're doing a lot of nighttime work because, you know, we had the opportunity to. There was lights under the bridge. It was sheltered from the rain or whatever might be happening. It was summertime. It was great to have long days of just painting and installing. A lot of different stories came out under those bridges at night, and a lot of different interesting like interactions. One specific was, you know, kind of a fella and his partner had come by, and they were, you know, talking about a gerbil that was important to them, and like, could you integrate a gerbil into this work? And it had nothing to do with like, you know, what we were working on. We're working on like the CP rail influencing the kind of major shift in what the landscape looked like here, and the sort of like introduction of the Northwest Mounted Police, and this really like historic kind of thing with a sweeping landscape and all this kind of stuff. And then, you know, but within the clouds of the like rail line, figured out really quick, just like, oh, that already kind of looks like a gerbil. So just like pulling out this kind of rat-like shape, you know, gerbils are that's such a random animal to try to like, you know. Then the next night we were there and painting again, and he brought his gerbil. No way. You know, he showed up the next night and like, and like showed the gerbil the picture of itself in the wall that we'd painted it, and just like, here's the gerbil now represented. It was subtle enough that like, again, you'd kind of show it out as like, but it created like a sense of connection. This individual who obviously frequents the area, who's down there now, has like an individual story to kind of connect himself to that work. And that didn't take very long for me to do, but it, I think, serves this like really valuable purpose for letting people kind of into and take ownership over the work. And it, you know, within the context of what we ended up creating, there was a lot of like room for people to kind of come and like actually interact with the work, almost like a big coloring book. So we had like a side of a train, and you could tell like some people who most likely paint trains and might be, you know, known as sort of like, you know, part of this tagging or graffiti community in Calgary, like came by and like tagged the train in the painting, but did it in such a way that like it integrated really well. You know, so there was like one night we got like our piece got bombed, but in this like really small, subtle, specific way. So we never had to paint it over. So they like became part of the work and the story of that by painting the trains in the piece. And I think like it provided a neat, like, just a neat bit of learning for like how we can maybe provide more like voice for a community, like, you know, add your mark, but do it in a way so that like bylaw services doesn't come and make us paint it out, or, you know, like I'm less precious about it as long as you're adding to things in the city here in like some type of a respectful, like will to create type of way. That's where I think most people can get on board with that.
For sure.
The permission of the artist to like maybe integrate your work into their work exists with that sort of like clause. Like if you're gonna do it, be mindful. You know, be aware.
That's incredible. I love those stories.
Yeah, totally.
So we have one question that we ask every guest on the podcast. The plan here is to create a big, interesting map that selfishly I just know cool places to go to. So can you tell me a city that you love anywhere in the world and why?
Just one city. That's hard. Narrow it down to just one. How are you going to be known? Just this one city, your favorite city. Could be this, you know, like the random little town of, just so many. I really connected to this little place called Waiua in El Salvador. They have like the Festival de Gastronomique, I believe, is like a food festival that is this really nice kind of inclusive, like open to all type of thing where people just come and cook and you know, pay for their food. But it's really like family based kind of like food production, and from like the farmers and the people around to just like get together and sort of, it puts this little town like on the map in El Salvador for like a place where people could go to have amazing food and share like in this sort of Central Plaza area, which I loved every part of like Central America, Mexico, for having these like central plazas that didn't necessarily have anything to do with needing to buy something, but then the food existed because you're hanging out there, and there was this sort of economic thing that got stimulated. But I got to paint a mural there, and you know, people just let me. They just let me because I was interested, because I was drawing in the park one day and someone was like, you know, talking to me about their little like street that had different murals from different artists. And I've heard since then it's been painted over because it wasn't, I did it in a day and it was above a bridal shop and it was a little dark, I think, for what they wanted. And, you know, but the town itself was just like beautiful, you know, in the kind of shadow of a big volcano and this sort of like lush landscape. But then like the town and the mentality around it was just like really embracing kind of like artistic process. There was little studios, craftspeople, artisans, makers, and then like the culinary stuff was just there, and it was embedded in the culture, because this festival was happening, I think, basically like every week or once a month. It wasn't like once a year. It was like you go to that town on Sunday because it's a festival of food.
360 Degree City is created by our team at Intelligent Futures, a firm that works at the intersection of urbanism, sustainability, engagement, and design. This week, you also heard from Jeff Robson, our design lead. You can find show notes and links on this episode at 360degree.city. I'm John Lewis. Thanks for stopping by.